Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
So, how did we find ourselves in a position of sometimes distressingly low voter turnout, chronically weak candidate recruitment, and not even deference to the process of politics, but downright acute contempt? Welcome back, and thank you for supporting the most widely watched source of Carolina business and public policy. I'm Chris William, and this time on CBR, our resident political brain trust will do more than just predict elective winners and losers, but what is inside baseball, so to speak, about the midterm elections? And how do the decisions made on Election Day radiate out into 2015 and beyond? Well, the dialogue starts now.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, Dr. Michael Bitzer, Catawba College, Tom Jensen, Director of Public Policy Polling, Dr. Karen M. Kedrowski, Winthrop University, and Andy Shain, The State. And now, here's Chris William.
Hello, welcome to our program. These are always interesting dialogues, guys, and I'm sorry, Karen, guys, and welcome to this. See, it's already starting that way. You know, let's talk fairly broadly for a second here. We were talking before off camera. Tom, I had asked you a question about what you had noticed in polling. Let me couch it this way. It seems like, you know, every election cycle we say, oh my gosh, it's so negative. The Hagen-Tillis race, let's take that for example. It's not about who can do the job, it's about who is the bigger demon. What have you noticed about polling in this election cycle?
Well, we've really seen in an unprecedented way this cycle is that in most of the major races across the country, voters don't like either candidate. So in almost every major race, they're sort of making a lesser of two evils calculation. And the reason we're seeing these favorability ratings for candidates that are historically bad was that there was so much outside spending attacking the candidates so early this year, in some cases starting even a whole year before the election, that the voters were really had the candidates defined negatively in their minds before the candidates even had a chance to try to define themselves.
Thomas Jefferson once said, and this just kind of popped in my mind, he said during a particularly acrimonious debate during his time in public service, he said it's not bad public policy or it's not bad politicos, but it's defective citizenship. So does the responsibility fall to the voter about this process, about how negative this process has become? Anyone?
I think it does, but you also have to understand that the voters themselves have kind of aligned themselves into distinct groups. So you've got the very strong partisans who do not see anything that they like in the opposition. And then you've got people who are kind of in the middle, 5, 10, maybe 15%, who are truly pure independents, but they don't like either party. So it really is a kind of, I don't like the opposition if I'm a strong partisan, and if you're in the middle, you don't like any of them.
Yeah, anyone?
Well, and I would say, too, that one of the great challenges in a race that becomes negative is that once a candidate has been defined negatively, the best that they can do is to put out a message in the hopes of muddying the waters. And so nobody ever comes out looking really virtuous or a clean politician, and negative messages are used because they work. sadly.
Yes,
They also undermine voter faith in the political process. So it has a couple of important outcomes in terms of elections.
And with the Hagen-Tillis race, it is pretty much, who do you hate more? Do you hate Washington or do you hate Raleigh? It's not even so much the individuals as it is kind of the institutions, the entity that we're now seeing in this North Carolina U.S. Senate race.
You know, I know this sounds like a Pollyannish question, but isn't that a bad way to go, Andy? Isn't that a bad way to go, to decide on divisiveness rather than what the commonalities are and what the real issues are?
I think so. And what I've been thinking a lot about is that we're the moderate candidates. We're the candidates who can somehow come in the middle on some issues. I mean, I think you're because of this, North Carolina and South Carolina, candidates are forced to their edges at this point. Is that really how they would be once they get into office? I mean, the idea that right now that Democrats, you have to really go to that base. Republicans, you really have to go to that base. Is there room for anybody in the middle? And is there room for voters in the middle? And that 10 to 15% who are independents, where do they go?
Is that because the money flows to the extremes in the debates? I mean, let's look at cable news shows. You've got MSNBC and you got Fox. They balance each other out. You used to have CNN in the middle, but now CNN is more tabloid than anything else because it drives ratings. But Michael, you said there are 10 to 15% true independents, but aren't there more folks in the middle that are much more moderate, that are looking for leadership and not negative divisiveness?
Certainly, if you look nationally, the moderates are the kind of plurality. I mean, it's kind of a nice distribution within the electorate. But what you also see are the folks who are engaged and who become part of the process. And when you're talking about particularly primary elections, we're talking about a general election that for the vast majority in North Carolina at least, most of these seats are already decided. We're talking about a competitive U.S. Senate race, but you get down into the congressional districts, you get down to the state legislative races, all of those districts are pretty much decided, and it's about who those candidates from those parties can appeal to and who shows up when those decisions are made in primary elections.
And that's true in South Carolina too. I mean, pretty much everything's decided at this point. Let's be honest.
Yeah, Tom, in the polling, not necessarily in the methodology, but the outcome of the polls, do you see any marked change to say that North Carolina? North Carolina's, somebody said 2 states. You've got red rural, red state, and then you've got blue municipalities. Interesting balance. But do you see that North Carolina's political leadership, in as much as it's been Republican the last at least 2 years, is this going to change at all?
It's not going to change in this election. There's probably going to be some gains for Democrats in the state legislature, largely because Republicans won every competitive seat in 2012, so they have to defend everything now in 2014. But you're talking max Democrats picking up maybe 4 or 5 seats in the state house, 1 or 2 seats in the state senate. You're going to start January with a state government that looks very similar to the current state government, and that's really a function of gerrymandering more than anything else. The lines have just been drawn in such a way that there aren't that many competitive districts, and there aren't very many districts that can sort of switch back and forth. And I think the most fascinating place where you see that is in our congressional elections in North Carolina. Out of our 13 congressional elections, I don't think a single one will be decided by single digits. The Republicans will win all of their races by somewhere in the 10 to 20, 25 point range. The Democrats in the 3 districts that have been drawn up for them, they'll win by 50 or 60 points. And that's how you get to 50-50 state overall, which we are, is 3 districts that are D plus 50 and 10 districts that are R plus 10.
Was there any surprise here among the gang about the Supreme Court's ruling on the redistricting? And wasn't the redistricting, wasn't it the South Carolina-based redistricting case? Was that a surprise to you?
I'm not really. I mean, to a certain degree, I think. I'm sorry, I'm stuck for a second.
Yeah, we all get that way. Sorry.
To a certain degree, I don't think there was much of a surprise to that because, in the end, they did draw enough for Democrats. They did do enough to get for both parties to give enough representation. I mean, Karen, what do you think about that?
I think you're spot on. And when we get to redistricting, I think that also helps explain why we see such a contentious political culture. As the districts have been drawn to be majority-minority district or heavily favoring one political party over another, what we find are that the constituencies within those districts are very homogeneous. So that means that lawmakers don't need to move to the middle. They don't need to compromise because there's no political value there for them. As long as they can please their constituencies, who are very, very homogeneous, they're going to get reelected. And in fact, I think one of the more interesting things that has happened perhaps in the last 45 or 50 years in politics is that compromise used to be a good word. Right?
Yes.
Compromise meant that you were willing to work together, you were going to sit down and put your differences aside and work on behalf of the best of the country. Now, if you compromise, it means that you are backing away from your principles. And that good politicians, good office holders are ones who stick to their principles.
So, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, is that still a fact? I mean, and for the Republicans, a leftover of the Tea Party. I know we've talked a lot about how the Tea Party influence has come down, but at the same time, that expectation that you're going to fight for your base, that you're going to fight for those basic things, is still there with voters.
Yeah, speaking of voters, we've had a trending down of voter engagement from 2006 to 2010. How would you think that this midterm is going to show for that total voter number?
For North Carolina, we're probably going to hit again kind of in maybe the low 40s. But some early numbers in terms of mail-in ballots seem to indicate that both sides are energized, and actually Democrats are performing better at mail-in balloting than they traditionally have been. So something is going on the ground. I don't know if your polling has picked it up, but I'm almost thinking that Democrats are almost as energized as Republicans are. And I think with the early votes, the in-person voting, that may actually push us up a little over maybe 45%, maybe 46% here in this state. Midterms are always horrendous. For the partisans, they will show up. For the unaffiliated voters, in 2006, there was only 26% of them registered that showed up. In 2010, it was a little over 30%. So those folks won't show up. It is indeed the partisans, and we've been talking about base election year. I think that's where this is really driving it to.
Michael gave you a great segue. How is that polling?
What's really interesting, and we're seeing this in North Carolina and nationally, is we're finding an electorate in North Carolina that looks more similar to a presidential year electorate than to the last midterm electorate. It certainly still won't be as good of an electorate for Democrats as you would see with Obama on the ballot, but we're not seeing nearly the drop in Democratic interest that we did in 2010. And I think the reason for that is Democratic voters have learned the lesson of what happened when they didn't show up and vote. Republicans got control of the legislature, and they were able to draw up the district lines in such a way that they'll have control of the legislature for the next 10 years. So Democrats who I think in 2010 were sort of fat and happy because they had control of everything and didn't have a sense of urgency about turning out to vote, they've now seen, if we don't vote even in these lower interest elections, there really can be major repercussions for that.
And Republicans in South Carolina have certainly been in control and in the wheelhouse for many years. In North Carolina, not so long, about 2.5 years. Does anyone, Michael, Andy, do you see that Republicans, what many have been critical about Republicans in North Carolina is overreaching in so many ways. Is that going to come back and bite them in this election or at some point soon?
Well, they have to be cognizant that they've got a Republican governor up for re-election in 2 years. And the concern is if Republicans lose in those kind of competitive suburban districts, that takes out the more moderate Republican voices within the Republican conferences in both the state House and the state Senate. So what you may end up seeing is after this election, potentially, the Republicans shift even further to the right, but you have a moderate Republican in the governorship who needs to run statewide, and statewide it is very much more competitive. So I think for Governor McCrory, he may turn to the legislature in January and say, look, just chill out. Y'all need to not go as far as you've been in the past 2 years.
And let me stay with you for a second. Hold on, just a second, Andy. I want to say, like you all to comment on this if you have, but Michael, it would seem like the General Assembly in North Carolina is not so keen on whether McCrory keeps the job or not. I mean, you look at the Senate, you look at the House, And I don't know that they've all three been working together.
Well, they haven't. And, for basically the leader of state government to be the Senate President pro tem, Phil Berger, who has really been driving the agenda in a lot of this. And then who's going to be the next speaker in the House? I think that's going to be the more fascinating election after November 4th. That all plays into a Republican Party that is split on rural grounds, on Tea Party versus social issues. There's a whole host of things going on within the North Carolina Republican Party that could potentially impact how 2016 gets played out.
Thoughts on that same thing?
I would just add that to a Republican legislature, even a bad Republican governor is going to be better than a Democrat.
The really interesting thing I think we saw in the North Carolina legislature over the last 2 years is that in 2013, the legislature pursued a very aggressive agenda, made everybody really angry. Their poll numbers got really, really sort of to the scary point. This summer in the short session, they chilled out compared to that. And the voters really, truly have forgotten about a lot of what.
You think they have short enough memory about that?
They do. We were finding at the end of summer 2013 that when you asked people in North Carolina, how would you vote if there was a legislative election today, Democrats were winning that question by 10 points. Now it's a tie. So the Republicans, simply by sort of calming down this summer and also combining with unhappiness about Obama, have pretty much come back completely to where they were before the 2013 session. So in that context, I think what we may see is 2015, they kind of get excited again and do a lot of stuff because they've seen that they can do that in the odd year, and that if they then tone it down in the even year, it might not have that much of an impact at the polls.
So you think if it's split like it is, like it's even, as you just said, that the incumbent's will rule the day in most cases?
Yeah, I think Democrats could get down to 72 Republicans in the House, maybe 30 Republicans in the Senate, maybe, but it's still going to be clear majorities.
Andy, we've been talking about Governor McCrory in North Carolina. In South Carolina, it looks like Nikki Haley is unless she does something extremely stupid, she is going to get reelected at this point. Has she learned some valuable lessons in these last 4 years? Is that what did it for her? Or did the economy come back and that helped it? I mean, what is it about Nikki Haley in South Carolina that's won?
I think it's a little bit of both. The hacking scandal that took place when we had 6 million information belonging to 6 million taxpayers stolen. At first, her reaction was, we couldn't have done anything. There was no one to blame. Soon that turned into, well, there were some things that we could do. And in the end, the head of the agency left. And she sort of said, we could have done better, and these are the things we are going to do better, and we're going to dedicate money for security. I think that enhanced people's confidence in her. I think that helped her a lot. And at the same time, the economy has improved. Especially the unemployment rate has dropped more sharply than it has nationally. I think that's going to help her, and she has made that the linchpin of her reelection campaign at this point. As well as saying, look, I've brought 57,000 jobs, and she goes to every ribbon cutting and every grand opening and every announcement she can to make sure that she is there with the CEOs and at the photo ops to know that she is responsible and that she's had a hand in this.
Which stands in stark contrast to what Mark Sanford did that would run the other way when it came to economics.
Well, exactly. Mark was, a lot of what Sanford was about was not wanting to look like he was having to pay those incentives, those taxpayer dollars in order to get these jobs. Sanford was really wanting, to a certain degree, I think, wanted a very limited government, wanted to sort of let the free market go. Let's not pick winners and losers. Whereas Haley has taken that and run, and again, as I said, with the economy and especially the numbers improving, I think that's helped her a lot. Whether or not anyone or all the economists agree that she's really responsible for it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. By the way, Sanford, how has he done as a congressman for the Low Country?
I think Sanford is the original Tea Party congressman. I mean, he was doing this. He was doing this back, back in the 90s, and so here he is back again, and it's like that shirt that you had that was in style, went out of style, now it's back in style. He's back in style.
Or like the clock that stopped. It's going to be right twice.
And he works well in Charleston. Charleston is the place where he will get elected. Could he win statewide office again? I don't think so.
Hasn't Charleston become a little bit more progressive though than its original?
Well, I would say that Charleston reflects a lot of urban areas in the country. There's the urban core is Democratic, affluent, well-educated, and liberal,
but
and
moderate Democratic.
it depends. I can get pretty blue in certain pockets. They just might be small pockets. But then surrounded by affluent Republican exurbs, suburbs, and surrounding metropolitan areas. So the district that Sanford is in, which was his original district, is safely gerrymandered Republican. He has deep roots in the area. He is going to get reelected safely there. I don't think he has a statewide political career
And
anymore.
in fact, nobody ran agained him.
Yes.
In the
And,
primary or in the general.
Because
and
of his
too
strength
many
in that-
strange things keep happening
What,
on
tell us about
Facebook and elsewhere.
we don't have enough time for that kind of stuff. How about Lindsey Graham? Have you done any polling on Lindsey Graham in South Carolina?
Yeah, he's up by about 20 points. It's interesting. He's not that popular. He's actually, when you look at his approval numbers, he's one of the least popular senators in the country. You usually see him about a 40% approval, 50% disapproval. But the reason for that is because a lot of Republicans don't like him. That's what drives down his approval numbers. But they don't dislike him so much they're going to vote for a Democrat in the general election. So that's how you get to a situation where you can have a 40% approval rating but win with 55, 60% is because plenty of people just sort of hold their nose, vote for you anyway because you have an R.
Yeah, sure. Lindsey Graham and Brad Hutto? How do you say it? Hutto. Yeah, I keep saying it. Hutto. Any kind of, what do you think? Is there a chance?
Hutto got in the race late because there was a Democratic candidate who basically the Democrats couldn't trust. Almost an Alvin Green situation from a few years back, and they recruited Hutto to run. Hutto is a likely candidate in 2018 to run for governor, so this is a good trial run for him, I think, and I think that's what's behind all of this. But he got in rather late, and again, just because how red South Carolina skews, it might be Lindsey Graham, but it's better than Brad Hutto.
Yeah, right. We've got, we talked about Hagan and Tillis and how close that race is. Tom, here we are. I mean, by the time this broadcast airs, it might have changed, but is it way too tight to call?
So what we'd been seeing for the last month was that polls were consistently showing Hagan up by 3 or 4 points. But one of the reasons she had that advantage was because Democrats had sort of united around her to a greater extent than Republicans had united around Tom Tillis. And as the election gets closer, we're starting to see that, for instance, some people who didn't vote for Tom Tillis in the primary, who in earlier polls were saying they were going to vote for the Libertarian for the Senate, they're now coming back into the fold. So at this point, I think it's really a tie, 1 or 2 point race, and it really could go either way. And one thing that I think we just have to keep in mind is that this election's not happening in a vacuum. When you look at the biggest Senate races across the country, they are generally moving in a Republican direction right now. And Kay Hagan sort of held on longer than most of the Democrats in really close races, but there is a decent chance that she's going to see the same fate as her fellow incumbents who are mostly trailing at this point.
And this is another one. And Michael, I'd like you to kind of wade in on this. We talked a little bit before the show. Talk specific politics. President Obama, will this Ebola crisis, if it is a crisis, and it certainly seems important, as it develops, whichever way it goes, does the Ebola crisis become President Barack Obama's Katrina?
It's certainly 60 years are never kind to presidents. And, we're seeing this same kind of disapproval in the low 40s. People are voting for the challengers when it comes to the president's incumbent party members. I think certainly the response is the key in terms of presidential awareness to an issue. And with his appointment now of somebody as a point person, I think he actually learned the lesson from the BP oil spill, that they needed to get more ahead of the issue than necessarily let it drive the concerns. I think that's what happened with George W. Bush with the Katrina issue. I think looking at the BP oil spill, they realized we needed to get out ahead of it. It's starting to happen. The fear is there. And I think when people, sense that fear within themselves and within the country as a whole, that's when the president really has to react and be firm, presidential in his manners.
In about 30 seconds, do you think the fear of 10 seconds, fear of Ebola, will that distort the election outcome?
I think the impact will be in whatever it does to Obama's approval rating.
Okay.
The lower Obama's approval rating, the worse for the Democrats in the midterm.
Yeah, all right. That'll be the final word. Tom, welcome back. Good to have you on the program. Karen, nice to see you again. Michael, as always. And Andy, please come back more than just 10 years later.
Sure. Okay. That'd be great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Until next week, I'm Chris William. Hope your weekend is good. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care, when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.